Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Ash Maria with us. Ash, thank you so much for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure, Branson.
Absolutely. Now, Ash, you're one of the main characters in the lean startup movement. So you've actually written a book on it, literally. You wrote Running Lean, and you're also the founder of Spark 59. So we'll get into your book in just a moment because there's going to be a lot there that our audience will want to learn from. But let's start with Spark 59. Tell us, what is Spark 59?
Sure. So I'll give you the short answer first and maybe a slightly longer answer. But the short answer is that it's a company I started fairly recently, and our mission is to help entrepreneurs succeed. And we do this by providing tools, content, coaching that help them raise their odds of success. The longer answer is I've been an entrepreneur for over a decade now. And throughout that process, I've been in search for just better, faster ways for building products, building successful products. And I started a blog, got sucked into the lean startup world, which we can talk a little bit more about. And just through that process of blogging, kind of a book came out of that process. And I realized that a lot of the lessons that I was learning was resonating with other entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. A lot of the problems I ran into were resonating with other entrepreneurs, as well as some of the partial solutions I started building. And so I decided, I was having so much fun doing that as a side activity. Why not make that be the full-time thing? So I sold my previous company, my previous business, and decided I was just going to do this because I just love being with entrepreneurs, and that's what I do now.
Yeah, is a lot of what you help them with, the lean principles, is that kind of the core of your guidance with these startups?
Sure, that has been the biggest influence, although I will say that a lot of what even goes into my book has just been a culmination of many different, so I can say it's all lean, and people reading the book will also say, hey, this is not just completely lean startup by the book. It's just a culmination of many different ideas, experiences that I've had, and borrowing from many, many different places. But one of the biggest influences for sure has been the lean startup, the lean influence.
Yeah. On the homepage of spark59.com, you have this great graph where you kind of have the why, the how, and the what. And I was looking at this, the why is to help entrepreneurs succeed. That's kind of the high level, what you're doing it. How is practice trumps theory, is what you say there. What do you mean practice trumps theory?
Sure, and maybe just to give again credit where credit is due, that circle, the three circles that you're seeing, is the golden circle, which is a concept that Simon Sinek kind of popularized, he introduced, and there's a very interesting TED talk, and he also wrote a best-selling book kind of around that way of thinking about how leaders communicate their messages. He uses Apple and Dell as examples. In this case, counter-examples of how Apple communicates well and Dell doesn't, what they do. So I kind of use that. But to answer your question specifically, so the why is definitely, our why is helping entrepreneurs succeed. The how is practice trumps theory, because we believe more of entrepreneurship being akin to a martial art. It's something that you learn by doing. It's like you can't learn how to play golf just by a book or watching a bunch of videos. You actually have to go out there and play it. Same thing with the martial art, you have to go and practice. Entrepreneurship is no different. And so everything that goes into my book, into our work, is all from first-hand experiential learning. It's either lessons we have learned building products of our own, or working side by side with other entrepreneurs, helping them do the same thing. So that's where that practice trumps theory comes from.
Yeah, and after the why and the how, there's the what. And you break it down to three sections on what you actually use to help these entrepreneurs. You have tools, you have content, you have coaching. Under the tools, we'll get to the Lean Canvas in a moment because we'll talk about that when we talk about your book because that's a part of it there. But you have something called the user cycle. What is the user cycle? What is that tool?
Sure. So user cycle is a product that we built that helps entrepreneurs be able to measure their progress in their startups. So it's a data analytics type of a product. So it's analytics as well as part analytics, part CRM. Mm-hmm. And so it essentially helps it helps entrepreneurs measure the progress that they're making in their products, be able to then make adjustments, run experiments, and improve those numbers.
Yeah. Is that available for consumers, or is that just something they get when they work with Spark 59?
No, we are making it, it's publicly available. We have, I have a certain methodology on how I release products. So we have released it in more of an early access form because we want to make sure we are building the right products. So we have, to date, had about maybe 100 customers use the product, and we're now kind of slowly beginning to open the doors, and we're going for the next kind of batch of customers.
Yeah, I would expect nothing less from you than to test and see what people want before you actually release the product. It would be bad if you didn't take your own advice, right?
Yeah, everything we do, including the book, has been just buy the book. And funny enough, chapter 2 in the book is how I wrote the book using the principles in the book, which sometimes blows people's minds because it's like very, very meta-recursive there.
Yeah, it's meta. So Ash, let's talk about your book a little bit, Running Lean. Running Lean came out, I believe, in 2010. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so that makes it one of the earliest books on this whole lean startup movement. Did it actually come out before Eric Ries's book?
Technically, yes, but I would say that both our books really. So Eric, of course, started blogging about lean startup. He was the first person to do that. He's the one who coined the term lean startup. But both of us really wrote our books by way of blogs first. So there's a lot of articles he wrote, a lot of articles I was writing. He decided to take the standard publishing route because he wanted to amplify his message, and so for that reason, he kind of went through a typical waterfall cycle, and his book didn't come. Typically it's a 1.5 year cycle, and I took a very non-traditional route. While I was writing my book, I began to test it, did a lot of testing around it by way of workshops. I began to even incrementally release the book out. So I wrote it I self-published the first edition of the book as a ebook, and so for that reason, I got it to market a lot sooner, and then I revised it almost entirely and came up with the second edition, which then got published and picked up by O'Reilly Media.
Yeah, so you could say it's the first lean book because it's the first book that was actually lean in and of itself, right?
Yeah, it was definitely a case study in lean book writing for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So this is, all these interviews are really for growth. They're for growth hackers and people trying to understand growth, kind of at the highest level. Tell us, why do the principles of lean really matter for growth? And then we'll get into some of the details of the book. But is there a connection between growth potential, and being a lean startup?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say that in many ways, some of the earliest stages of a startup is all about establishing a strong foundation on which to grow. So obviously pursuing growth just for growth's sake is going to be premature optimization. And so a big tenet in lean is one of identifying where customer value comes from, and one of the tenets there is being able to deliver value before you scale that value out. And so a lot of what my book really talks about kind of in the earlier stages is how do you set up that foundation so that you have identified customers, you can deliver value to them. We want to test those things in small scales, a lot of small scale testing, a lot of validation to make sure value is being delivered, we're capturing the right value from customers back. And then at that point, we apply the same techniques, the same experimentation techniques to then optimize a plan that is working. Yeah. So the subtitle of my book is, going from plan A, which is what where we think we want to go, to a plan that works. And so it's this iterative process through experimentation to get to a plan that's starting to work, and then the growth part comes in when we want to accelerate or scale that plan out.
Yeah, so lean really is the foundation for sustainable long-term growth. So let's talk about the sections of your book here. The first section, the part 1, is called Problem Solution Fit. And then your part 2 is Product Launch Fit. And then part 3 is Product Market Fit. Now, out of those 3, we hear a lot about part 3. That's kind of the buzzword right now, the Product Market Fit, a PM Fit. It even has its own kind of shortened version, right? We don't hear a lot about part 1, Problem Solution Fit, or maybe not as much. At a high level, what is the Problem Solution Fit?
Sure. So in a nutshell, it's basically trying to find problems that are worth solving before committing any time to them. So many entrepreneurs, when they get hit by an idea, they just get so enthralled and passionate about the idea, mostly around the solution, how they're going to solve this thing. They don't spend enough time setting the right foundation, not just for growth, but even this idea having any merits whatsoever. And so we just rush into this build cycle, and in the hopes that we'll build something valuable and then maybe run into the scaling problem. Problem Solution Fit kind of turns that around and says, before you invest any time building, you can get outside the building and go validate whether this is something worth pursuing. Yeah. So for me, the book was a great case in point. I had no interest in writing this book, just to be honest. I was too busy running my own business. when I got, and many of these were were inbound requests. So some of my readers were pulling this out of me, saying, you should write a book because it's good content. It would make for a good book. And I started this process of validation, and we can talk about some of the things that I did there. But it was this process of validation to convince myself that if I was to invest any time, even 2 or 3 months or maybe 6 months of my life, that it would be for something, there would be some goal at the end that would make me feel like that was not time ill spent.
Yeah. So how did you validate? I'm interested.
Sure. So there are a whole lot of techniques there, and so maybe just the classic example is that if before you build a product, just going and trying to communicate that out to customers, whether it's by way of a smoke test, by putting up a landing page and seeing if anyone clicks, if anyone gives you their email address, if anyone pre-orders, those are all different ways for gauging demand and gauging interest. So in my book, because I had a blog, I had at least an early adopter audience in mind, and I knew who they were. So since they were asking for the book, I just turned around and asked them back and said, why do you want me to write this book? In some ways, trying to talk them out of the idea. Mm-hmm. And they came back and pretty much gave me the unique value proposition that eventually became how I differentiated my book. And they said that there wasn't shortage of all this content, but they particularly connected with my how-to approach to Lean. And if I wrote a book that kind of covered that in great length, it would be a great resource. So for me, that was step one, is understanding, what would be the differentiation of this book. And then I went and wanted to make sure it was a problem worth solving. So I did a back of the envelope calculation. Everyone underestimates how long projects take. Mm-hmm. I thought this would be a 3-month project, tops. So I did a back of the envelope calculations and figured that if I got 1,000 people to commit to buying this book, or ideally pre-ordering this book, then I would at least break even. And that's how that was the basic math I did. And so I didn't go into writing this book. I went and put up a landing page first, and spread word about it. And through that process, once I hit 1,000 users, that's when I really took when I took this idea seriously for the first time. Until then, I was doing all these little experiments to get to problem solution fit.
Yeah, that's great. How long did it take you to get to 1,000 emails? Was that a short process or a long process?
So it was not as short as I anticipated, or I would have hoped. I put it out there. It took about 2.5 months. Yeah. So the point I first announced it in March of 2009, I believe it was not until early summer that I really hit that number. Yeah. And again, during that time, I was not obsessing over the book. So I've obsessed over many products that have gone nowhere. Mm-hmm. So I was too busy running my other business, my other products. I put this out there. I would periodically check in and tweet things out and make sure the numbers were kind of steadily climbing. But that's all I did. It was mostly getting it to that 1,000 mark versus trying to start fantasizing about the content of the book necessarily.
Yeah. And back in 2009, when you put up that smoke screen, that landing page, Lean wasn't a household term. It's become very popular. But back then, it was something very new that you were on the edge of. And so you really were a few steps ahead of kind of the rest of the industry. So I would expect it to take a few months, where if you were to put out a version 2 of this book, it'd take you 1 day to get 1,000. So just the landscape has changed so much because of your work and other people.
Right, absolutely. And most people launching any business, because I always hear this now, is that people say, well, Ash, it's very easy for you now because you have a platform. You can put any product out there. Your 37 Singles can put any product out there, and there'll be there'll be hundreds of people just lined up to do a beta test for you. And I tell them that, yeah, but they didn't start out that way. They all had to start with product 1. And it does take time. It's not this myth of the overnight success is something we need to get away from. It's important to build a platform. It's important to have access to customers, but you have to start with 0 customers. Even Seth Godin has this famous blog post that he did. When he started blogging, he was blogging for 3 people because he was so far out. No one was reading blogs back then, but he kept doing it. And I think for the first several months, he only had 3 people. And now, he's got hundreds of thousands of people that follow him every day.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said, practice trumps theory. If you actually practice entrepreneurship, you realize really quick that nothing is successful right away, that it takes so much work and so much, tenacity and so much time that all these misconceptions are spread by people who don't really run startups. That's the only thing I can figure out.
Right. And it makes for an interesting story. The person in, student in dorm creates Facebook and overnight success. It's just one of those things where we love that. They miss all the hard work that went kind of in the middle there.
Yeah. Now, underneath the problem solution fit, the first thing is really the lean canvas. And now we're not going to do a deep dive into this because it can be its own thing. And there's actually a whole book now just on the lean canvas itself. But at a high level, what is the lean canvas, just in case people aren't familiar with it, and so they know how it fits into really finding a problem solution fit?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll give you a very kind of high level description of what kind of is underlying even just the book in general. So I would say that the epiphany that I had was realizing that too many entrepreneurs fall in love with the solution, but the solution they build isn't the real product of a startup. The real product is a business model and ideally a working business model. And when I kind of took that, once I realized that, I was able to apply a bunch of principles that I knew from the product development world to the process of starting up. The first one is divide and conquer. If you were building a very complicated if you're tackling a very complicated technical project, you would break it up into its component pieces and systematically tackle it. Mm-hmm. That's what the first principle in my book is about. It's called document your plan A. So you take the process of starting a business and you break it into its component pieces. And that's what Lean Canvas helps you do. So traditionally, we'd use business plans to do this. We'd make entrepreneurs go away for weeks or months writing the 60-page business plan document. The problem is that nobody ever reads it. It's just this document that the entrepreneur kind of starts writing. They don't know the answers, so they start making up stuff, or they start looking at Gartner reports and using big numbers to make this sound somewhat intelligent. But it's all at that point work fiction. So most plan A's don't work. The problem isn't, or the goal isn't creating a perfect plan, but it's really creating a model or a plan, and that's where the Lean Canvas comes in. It lets you take your business idea and kind of decompose it into these component blocks. There are just 9 building blocks, and you can put it all on a single page. Mm-hmm. So when it's a one-page document, it takes you 15, 20 minutes to create the first version. The most important thing is it creates conversation. You take a one-page, even if you print this out and go into a Starbucks and talk to a potential advisor, potential investor, potential team member, co-founder, and show them this one-page document and say, this is what I'm trying to do. The other side cannot help but read it and not help but have an opinion about it. And that conversation is where the true success lies. It's where that real learning lies. Yeah. So that in a nutshell is what kind of Lean Canvas lets you do.
Yeah, and if people want to, they can just do a search and they can get, the Lean Canvas PDF. It's a one-page PDF. They can print it out and use it. And when you say it's one page, it's not one page of solid writing. It's one page of blocks and pictures. I mean, it's like you could put a few sentences on it and then you filled it out, which is why you say it can take 15 or 20 minutes. But there's actually more knowledge in that one page than in most business models. And that's why people can have an opinion, because, it's discernible what's actually going on because it is so visual.
Right, and it's an incredible tool, and it works for a number of reasons. One, the point you just made, it's so concise, and it forces you to get to the point faster. Mm-hmm. If you were with an investor, there's the metaphorical 30-second elevator pitch or the elevator ride conversation. You have to be able to get your message out very quickly. So in some ways, it's easier to write a 60-page document because you can just ramble on forever. Mm-hmm. But to force yourself to think critically, to put the most important words on the canvas can be quite tricky and hard. Yeah. So it forces you to actually do that, and that's kind of a very, very powerful exercise.
Yeah, there's this great Abraham Lincoln quote, and I don't know it verbatim, but after writing a letter, he apologized at the end of it that the letter wasn't shorter because he didn't have more time. And right. Wait a second. And actually, it takes more thought and more care and more time to do something concise than it does to ramble on. And so the Lean Canvas really is the business proposal, the business paperwork of the new startups, I believe. Now, you also mentioned earlier customer development. It's a phrase that we hear about all the time. And part of problem solution fit is really interviewing your customers. And you talk about 2 kinds of interviews, the problem interview and the solution interview. Tell us about those briefly. What are those?
Sure. So the whole notion of customer development is to go out there and validate something about the product that you're going to build, and many times even before you actually build it. So it's just that process of validation. And I will argue that there are actually maybe 3 ways of doing, or there are two main ways of doing this. One of them is just going out and observing customers, and that's where you kind of formulate these hypotheses on what the pain points are, what their needs are. And you can do this just by physically going to where customers hang out, being a fly on the wall and just watching them. You can do this online by going into discussion forums and chat rooms and seeing what they're talking about, what issues they might be raising. So all that kind of falls under the realm of customer research. But once you have those hypotheses, you now have to go and test them. And that's where these interviews come in, the problem interviews and solution interviews. And the goal of the problem interview is to make sure that we have identified the right customer. So I might think that I'm trying to build a service for, say, busy parents with young kids. And so I want to go and validate whether the problems that I have in mind are the problems that they also it resonates with them, and they also feel like they're big enough problems to go solve. So the problem interviews, we're not really pitching anything about the solution. We go into we have these casual conversations with customers, but they're very scripted and structured. And we are kind of outlining a short story about what motivated us to build this product, what problems we were trying to solve. And then we turn it around like a good interviewer does and let the customer speak. So they might say, oh yeah, these are problems I have as well, and they're important, they're not important. If they have this lukewarm response, you may not be on something. When they get physically excited and they say, oh, this is something I've been trying to solve for months, and we lose a lot of money, we lose a lot of time, we're frustrated, those are the kinds of emotions you want to see come out. And that there is also not enough. In the problem interview, you want to then go a step further. If a customer tells you this is something they want solved, you want to ask them, well, what are you doing about it today? And that's a lie detector that you can build in, because if they say this is a great problem to go tackle, yes, build this and I will buy it. And you ask them, what are you doing today? And they turn around and say, well, I'm doing nothing because I'm waiting for someone to solve it first. Then that may be one of those nice to have product categories where they think they want this, but when you build it, they don't actually buy it because they're just too busy with other things.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of the problem interview is to gauge your customers, gauge their problems, and understand what their existing alternatives are. What are they doing to solve those problems today? Once you get this information, I always tell people it feels like cheating, because you go and first ask customers, what it is they want built, and they give you all this ammunition because you have lowered their defenses, you're not pitching to them. But once you have all this information, you can then go and design the perfect product that actually tackles their top 1, 2, and 3 problems, and come back and pitch it to them and put a price and an offer along with it. And if they truly were telling you the truth in the first set of interviews, why wouldn't they want to buy this product? Because you're delivering exactly what they wanted. And that's what the solution interview does, is we come back, and ideally you want to have, by that point, you have filtered out what the top problems are. You ideally want to have a demo to go along with it to say, I understood your problems. This is how I propose I'm going to solve it. And so you show them some kind of a demo. So it's not the actual working product. It could be a screenshot, it could be a video, it could be a physical prototype. You say, this is how I'm going to go solve it. Does this sound compelling? And if they were telling you the truth and this was a problem they wanted to solve, if your demo was compelling, they're going to get excited and say, yes, I want this. How much is it going to cost? You tell them how much it costs, and if everything kind of matches up, you've got a deal and you've got a customer. Yeah. And that's really what the solution interview is all about.
I love when you said it feels like you're cheating at first. Sometimes we make entrepreneurship harder than it needs to be for whatever reason, especially when we ignore these lean principles. And so, the step one, the part one, is you find the problem solution fit. So you've got your lean canvas, you've interviewed your customers, you've talked about the problem, you've talked about a possible solution. If all things look good there's no big red flags in your canvas where, that piece of the business model is really broken, and now that I wrote it down, I see it. There's no big problems with the interviews. The customers are giving you the right answers, showing that it's a real problem, and they are trying to solve it, but with broken, solutions that don't really work, those kind of things. So now we move into the product launch fit. Now, if people don't talk about product solution very much, they very rarely talk about product launch. I think this may be the least talked about of the 3 categories in the book. So what at a high level is the product launch fit?
Sure. So if I were to characterize the first phase, the problem solution fit is about answering the question, do I have a problem worth solving? The second phase is getting you ready to answer the question, have I built something that customers actually want now? So on the one hand, once you get pretty good at the interview process, and unfortunately, since you're not building anything, technical feasibility is not being tested. So you can go and promise anything. I mean, I can go into an interview and say, would you like to go to Mars? Yes, pay me now and I'll give you this rocket ship that goes to Mars. And I could probably collect money doing that, because that's just at some point, it becomes a quality of how polished my pitch becomes.
Yeah.
But the real rubber hits the road when you actually have to deliver a solution where a customer derives value and then pays for that value. So you capture some of that value back. And that's what that second phase prepares you for. So it's all about taking the information that you got, which is customers are interested in this product, trying to distill it down into the smallest feature that you can build, so the smallest product that you can build. In the lean world, we call it the concept of the minimum viable product. So even though the customer may want all these bells and whistles that go along with your product in their fully realized vision, they may not need to start with all those things. If you can only address problem number one, I often like to use even the iPhone 1 example, is that iPhone 1, when it came out, was only solving three main things. They were trying to put an iPod, they were trying to put a browser and a phone in one device, and everything else was kind of left for future releases. So, multitasking, cut and paste. They've got a lot of, in some cases, bad reviews because they didn't have such basic features. But for them, that was not going to be the critical features that were needed in that first release. Yeah. So what we do in Product Launch Fit is figure out what are those minimum feature sets that we need, try to reduce scope to be as small as possible, because we want to speed up the learning. We don't want to spend time building multitasking and cut and paste and all those kinds of things. We want to get to the core. Yeah. So that's what we do there. We also build the infrastructure for measurement, because once the product leaves, if you're building software, I'm assuming you're building software, but once your software is out there, it's very hard to know what customers do with it, because you can't interact with them face to face like you did in the earlier interview stage. And so you want to have some way of measuring their behavior, their activity with your product. And so it also talks about how you set yourself up for those kinds of things.
Yeah, and you kind of move them through those phases with what you call release, and then you sell, and then you measure. Those are kind of the first three things with the product launch fit. Walk us through those three real quick. Some of it you've already hit on. You just hit on the measurement a little bit, but talk to us about the release, and then the sell, and then the measurement of it.
Sure, I'd probably use terms like build, measure, learn, which kind of probably aligns.
Yeah, that's kind of the more modern words we use, and yeah.
And so the whole idea of the build, measure, learn kind of loop is that we would build that minimum viable product, and we would put it in the hands of customers. And so it needs to be something that they can kind of touch, feel, play, and kind of derive value from.
So are they paying customers at this point?
Yeah, so that's somewhat dependent on your business model, and also kind of on your ability and kind of the pain points you're addressing. So, in most of the products that I build, I try to push for as close to payment as possible. I would like to get some kind of an advance pay. Now, many times customers, they're wary that this product may not work. Early adopters have no problem prepaying, others may not. So your mileage may vary. There are some ways for doing risk reversal. So one of them is still taking advance pay to get early access to this product. But if they don't derive value, say within 30 days or 90 days, you would gladly return their money back, because at the end of the day, if you don't deliver value, you just get to go home. So there are ways you can do risk reversal. So for me, I always push people to say, try to get as far down the funnel as possible. Ideally, get to revenue, because that's often there's a very big difference between giving something away for free and charging even the penny gap, charging even a penny for your product. Yeah. So for me, I always say that's the ultimate. That's the first. It's not the ultimate validation, but it's the first validation: is do customers actually pay for your product?
Yeah. So you build it, you're measuring it, you're learning from the data what's going on, and then you have something you call the MVP interview. So we know the MVP is a minimal viable product that you talked about. That one kind of main feature set that matters, not every possible feature bloat that we could throw into it. But what is the MVP interview?
Right. So I'm a big fan of speeding up learning. And so I just mentioned, you have to set the infrastructure for collecting data. But sometimes when you're dealing with small sample sizes, when you only have 10 or 20 customers, which is what you typically have when you get out of problem solution fit, trying to collect data may not give you the most statistically significant kind of insights. And
you don't have enough sample data, right?
Right. And so for that reason, you still have to do these face-to-face, or at least try to do as many face-to-face or over Skype type of conversations as possible. Even email kind of works. But creating that continuous feedback loop with customers is very important. So I have this notion of the MVP interview, which is part usability test and it's part kind of concierge service. So it's almost like saying, since you are an early adopter of mine, since you kind of have early access and you're very valuable to me, I would like to give you in some way special treatment. This is how you would sell it to the customer. Yeah. And you would say, we would help you onboard, we kind of help you get set up. But what you're really doing is you're giving them your product, which probably is going to have a lot of defects and bugs in the beginning, because no product, every product needs a maturity time to get to a point where it's usable, to where it kind of explains itself. So what you're really doing is turning this into a usability test where I say, Branson, thanks for being my customer. Here's the product, but I want to walk you through it, or I want to kind of support you. So why don't we set up a meeting where we can do this together? And so I have you walk through the product, but I'm really watching how you are interacting with it. And when you get stuck, I'm going to jump in and help you, which is what you really want because you don't want to be frustrated with the product. But what I'm doing is I'm making mental notes on what were all the problems that you ran into so I can go and fix those for the next customers.
Yeah, and again, this aids growth so much, just to bring it back to our kind of viewership, because when you fix these problems with 100 people in your user base, when you actually do acquire real customers, when you bring in hundreds and thousands more, the funnel isn't broken, the user experience isn't broken, the product isn't broken, so that you can actually capture the value of those customers. But you have to do this early on. This is the foundation for growth, even though it's not exciting. It's exciting to get written about in TechCrunch. Doing an MVP interview is not exciting because you got 20 customers and you're talking to one of them who's frustrated. But this is the foundation, so I can't just reaffirm that enough. Now, after they have the product launch fit, you move into part 3, which is the product market fit. Now, tell us, what is the product market fit, and then how do we measure that? Because it seems hard to measure sometimes.
Sure. So product market fit is a term that was popularized by Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape. And in one of his blog posts, he kind of described what it felt. So we kind of know emotionally what that should feel like. It's when your product is just flying out the door, when customers, there's more demand and you can't produce things fast enough. You're kind of getting overwhelmed just with customer demand. So all good problems to have. That's where we all would like to be one day. It's the tornado of the product cycle. And so he had kind of put this out there because he had been experiencing that with Netscape, and he said this is what it feels like, and this is what product market fit is. Unfortunately, we didn't have a very good way to measure what that is. So there's the kind of corollary of that is that if you have to ask if you have product market fit, you probably don't because you would know when it happens. But that's not very helpful either. But there on the other side, there are some very good indicators we have now, and that's where the whole realm of innovation accounting again comes in. Is we can use metrics and mathematically create models where we can measure things like engagement, we can measure things like referral if you were building a viral product, and see if you're actually making progress, if you're actually hitting the right triggers to where you're approaching product market fit, and if the trend continues, you actually kind of make that jump or into that realm. And that's really kind of the whole body of work that Lean helps you do. Is it really helps you incrementally measure from when you first launch the product and almost look for deltas versus absolutes. So I don't care that I have 10 customers today. Yes, I want to get to 100,000. But week over week, am I making improvements or am I spinning my wheels? That's really the basic question you want to ask.
Yeah.
And we have these metrics and these accounting measurement techniques where we can do those kinds of things. And that's really how you measure your way to product market fit.
Yeah. Define delta for me. What is that?
Sure. So it's changes from one week to the next. So typically when we look at metrics, we like to measure things on an aggregate basis. So my monthly conversion rate is 5%. Well, that's really interesting. What was it last month? That's what I really want to know. If it was 5% as well, what about 3 months ago, 5%? Well, it doesn't look like you're making any progress. You might be adding a whole bunch of features and you might be improving and doing a lot of these marketing things, but you're really kind of flatlined. And unfortunately, I call it the Groundhog Day effect, because if you really kind of even look at daily visitors to your site, like clockwork, they tend to behave very similarly. Taking seasonal adjustments aside and kind of day of week aside, 1 week on a Monday is going to be very similar to another week on a Monday for any kind of a product. And that's just the Groundhog Day effect, where your product just begins to flatline, all things being equal. So that's, on the one hand, while that's very depressing, it's also very motivating, because now you can try all kinds of experiments. You can get very aggressive and try new techniques. And if you see a spike in your numbers, you can correlate that back to something you did and then figure out how you can do more of those kinds of things and not do all the needless busy work stuff.
Yeah, it's almost good that it's Groundhog Day all over again, because then when you do something that matters, you can notice it as a real change in the analytics. Because if it was all over the place, it would be really hard to find the correlation and causality of your individual actions. So it's actually a good thing. Now, you tell people to don't be a feature pusher. I've done this the wrong way before. I have not taken this advice, and I regret it. What do you mean when you tell people not to be a feature pusher?
Yeah, so when it comes to the product, after we take all this great care to build this MVP. So I know and hopefully it came across as being some, people in your audience might be saying, what, you want me to go and talk to customers before I build stuff? That's just too much work. It's faster just to build it. I'll say the odds of building something are very low. So all of that stuff I described really helps you build the right product. Even that MVP interview, the usability test, it uncovers so many problems just at the beginning. And so I was going to mention this early on, is that usability test experts say you don't even have to talk to the hundreds of people that you kind of mentioned, is that within 3 to 5 people, you uncover 80% of usability problems. Yeah. So the learning comes very, very rapidly. But so all of that stuff is really very important in kind of setting that right foundation.
No, that's great. And so when it comes to features, how do we know when to add a feature because it's necessary and when that we're being a feature pusher? I mean, it's like Apple, you mentioned the copy and paste. It seems like that should have been a feature they pushed, right? And yet they didn't. Like, how do we know where that line is? Because it's so hard as an entrepreneur to kind of get outside of your own body and see things, objectively.
Right. So in Lean, there's this term of customer pull. So ideally, you want to see some customer demand for a feature. Just even jumping into the Apple example, those features were kind of feature parity types they were in that category where everyone knows that eventually you need to have them. Mm-hmm. But if they had them, nobody would buy the iPhone because it had cut and paste. They would buy it because it had a browser, a phone, and a music play, the iPod, all in one. Yeah. So that's how they were kind of distinguishing, is that so your features have to be different. They have to be things that customers really want. And if it gets in the way, so obviously at some point people were like, well, now I'm an iPhone 3 and I don't have cut and paste. Now I'm getting really, upset. Yeah. And so at that point they have to add it, but they don't have to add it day one. So that's part of, but even going to your point is that many times as entrepreneurs, and this is the point I was making early on, is that we take such great care in building that minimum feature. But once it's out there, unfortunately, for most products, we don't get this hockey stick curve. There's going to be a flat line first before things need to take off. So even the MVP is not guaranteed to succeed out the gate. Mm-hmm. But the mistake we make is we just start saying, oh, it's because we had this minimal product. It's because we didn't have enough features. So as entrepreneurs, we just start bloating that thing back up. And that's not the right answer either. What you want to do is repeat that process again, which is realize that the features you build, okay, maybe they're not perfect, maybe they're not complete. Chances are that more of your effort should be going to improving your existing features, because those are ones that customers said they wanted. Maybe they're just not working, well enough. Mm-hmm. And 20% of your effort should go in investing in new feature development. So still having that dialogue with customers to say, you're using this product, but is there anything that's lacking? And if there is, have this conversation with them and use that to prioritize what you push next, but more from a customer pull perspective, versus you saying, I'm just going to now blast this thing out to them and shove it down their throat.
Yeah. And what is the feature backlog? How does that play into this whole thing?
Sure. That's just a way of triaging features. So inadvertently, when you put the product out there, you are going to get all kinds of feedback. Customers are going to try to be helpful. So, some of them will give you feature ideas. You yourself are going to have improvements that you want to make in your product. And so the feature backlog is just a place to collect it. Yeah. And what we have found is that stuff just keeps growing and growing and growing to where now as a team, we're a small team. We don't even necessarily keep an official feature backlog. And this is something that I even first read in 37 Signals book, Getting Real, where they just kind of throw away all these feature ideas, because if a feature request is important, it will surface multiple times. Yeah. And so the first time you hear feature A, you're like, okay, that's interesting, good to know, but I'm not going to do anything about it. The 10th time you hear it, well, maybe you should pay attention to it. Yeah. So that's kind of another way of doing that feature triage. In the book, I also talk about this notion of key metrics. So if you're launching your product and you're worried about virality when nobody yet is reaching to that point because they have activation issues, they can't even create their account successfully. Mm-hmm. Trying to build features for that in the form of waste, because no one's ever going to get there. Yeah. So again, there are ways to prioritize features that way based on where the bucket is leaking the most.
Yeah. Now, one of the last sections of your book, you talk about experimenting with pivots. And pivots might be one of the most controversial parts of the lean startup movement, because people on the outside looking in, they consider it giving up sometimes, or not pushing through the hump, or whatever the phrase may be. Tell us, what do you think about pivots kind of in general, and how should we experiment with pivots, and when do we know to push through and when do we know to pivot? What's your thoughts on kind of that whole thing?
Sure. So that's become that's definitely a hard question. I'll do my best to answer it. I'll say that I also see the reverse happening, which is people actually using pivots kind of as an excuse to actually change direction, because now that they've gotten the permission to pivot from the lean startup, they actually proudly say, well, I tried something, it didn't work, and so I'm going to go pivot to something else as a justification that they're still on the right track, they're still trying, they're still being lean. So I kind of see both sides of it, and both are hard. Like being able to make the decision to pivot is hard, but also jumping into it prematurely sounds easy, but it's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
And so maybe, to kind of explain, why we have to pivot, I'll kind of talk about the hockey stick curve again. If you look at any successful company, they usually have a flat part of the hockey stick curve. And it's not because they weren't trying hard or they were too dumb in the beginning. It's just that before you can build something that works, you have to go through a lot of crap that doesn't work. And that's just the nature of entrepreneurship. It's just the nature of startups. So you have to try a lot of things, and many things will fail in the beginning, and then you eventually kind of find these breakthrough insights that start to make the rocket ship take off. And each one of those course corrections is what we would call a pivot. Now, a very important characteristic of a pivot is that it needs to be grounded in learning. So if you run an experiment and it fails, if you randomly just go and say, well, this failed, I'm going to try something different, that's not a pivot. That's a disguised see what sticks strategy. You're just trying random stuff, and maybe you'll get lucky and maybe something will work, but that's not the way we should be approaching pivots. So usually when experiments fail, I like to use a Buckminster Fuller quote, who was a kind of a well-known, renowned scientist. And what he said is that there is no such thing as a failed experiment. We just have unexpected outcomes. And so if you run an experiment and you don't get the outcome that you expect, don't treat it as a failure. Instead, try to dig deeper, and rather than running away from that failure, try to figure out what might have been the root causes for those failures. Maybe it's that you were targeting the wrong customers. Maybe it's that you had the price wrong. Maybe do some price testing. And so you come up with these different hypotheses. And so rather than running away from failure, you start to make these little course corrections, which would be kind of little pivots that we're making. And one of those might unveil a big insight in how to really, make your product take off.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Ash, this has been an incredible interview. I have one last question for you to end on here. I like to ask my guests at the very end, what's the best advice that you have for any startup that's trying to grow? It's a high-level, broad question. Take it anywhere you want.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, obviously coming from the lean background, I'm a big fan of rapid experimentation. So I would just say, even if you're trying to grow, you kind of have to have the basics in place, which is you have to have a very good system. It's like tuning an engine of what we call the engine of growth. So you have to have a pretty clear system and being able to benchmark that system. So having these baseline metrics in place. And there's a whole body of work there which we didn't get into. So using cohort versus aggregate metrics, very important. Because if you use aggregate metrics, sometimes you get misleading information on what is really working and what's not. So very important to be able to correctly baseline, create standard measure of progress for your particular product. And then be able to run experiments. And so you're running experiments, and many of your audience, I know, I'm sure, are aware of split testing and A/B testing, but you're doing those kinds of experiments and getting a little bit crazy there, because you can really draw cause and effect, and feel like that's ultimately the way you kind of iterate your way towards growth.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Ash, again, thank you so much for coming on the program and sharing so much of your knowledge with us.
Great. Thanks, Branson.